அனைத்து அமர்வுகளும் இனிதே நடைபெற்று முடிந்தது. அடுத்தது நம்ம புத்தக வெளியீடு, அதற்கு முன்பு ஒரு சிறப்பு விருந்தினரை நமக்காக இந்த நிகழ்வுக்காக அழைச்சிருக்கிறோம். அந்த சிறப்பு விருந்தினர் மிஸ்ஸஸ் கான்ஸ்டன்ஸ் சிங்கம். அவர்களை பற்றிய ஒரு சிறு குறிப்பு ஆங்கிலத்தில் சொன்னாங்க, அதனால நான் ஆங்கிலத்திலேயே செஞ்சிருந்தேன். This evening's guest of honor, Mrs. Constance Singham, is a civil society activist who is the right person to be here today, and former president, not once but 6-time past president of AWARE, that is Association of Women Action and Research. Mrs. Constance Singham came late to activism in 1978 at the age of 42, so it is not too late for us. To reinvent herself, went ahead to do her degree, and in 1986 she joined women's rights group AWARE. Since then she didn't look back. In the last 3 decades, Mrs. Constance had led women's organizations, co-founded civil society groups, been a columnist in several national publications, spoken at countless forums and seminars, contributed to and co-edited several books and written her memoir. In short, to describe about herself, about Mrs. Constance and her actions done for the society, I would like to quote what Mr. Elvin Tan, the founder and artistic director, says about Mrs. Constance. In his words, Constance Singham is the mother of civil society. She has inspired many generations of civil society activists. Her boundless energy has been responsible for numerous projects and initiatives that have shaped Singapore's civil society today. So we should be thankful to her. This says everything about this evening's special guest, Mrs. Constance Singham. With this, now I would like to invite Mrs. Constance Singham to deliver her speech on Indian women in Singapore. Mrs. Constance, please.
She's still going on. She's 90-something, I think, and she's still going on. Still strong, still talking about women. But what is important about this was that it was possible for him to recruit Indian women who gave up everything to join. They were just very young women, 16, 17, 18 years old, and some of them older. And the educated women became the leaders of the group. And they marched all the way to Burma. Finally, I just want to talk about, because what I wanted to tell you was about the achievements of Indian women and Tamil women, especially Tamil women in Singapore. And this is only a representative group. There are lots of women who have contributed and whose names we don't know. And that's the history that you have to write as a community, not just as a community, write it in English so everybody else would know about it. And that is the responsibility of the younger generation of women. Anyway, here we have, I want to start with Mrs. Devanaya, because she represents a lot of our Tamil women. A lot of the women, because what we have is very successful Tamil women, and then we also have a community of neglected Tamil women who still are strong women, who support their husbands, who do any kind of job they are able to do, or the cleaners and security guards, supporting men. Every woman in Singapore works. Every woman every woman who can't depend on their husbands, and if you know the history, a lot of Indian women can't depend on their husbands. Sorry, I'm a feminist. I'm talking about this session which is meant to see what we have done and what needs to be done. And that's one of the problems that we have to confront is how do we raise our sons? As mothers, how are we raising our sons? Because we are responsible for that, you know. And that is a subject for another conference, you know. Because that's the saddest part. The community, so rich in culture, so rich in history, is losing its influence in Singapore. And you have to get up and do something about it. I know you are trying. Anyway, I'm wondering again. These are the groups of women that who have contributed a lot to Singapore. I have, Mrs. Devanaya. Mrs. Devanaya didn't have much education. You know, and so much was demanded of her life and of her work. She was Tamil, and Devanaya was Malayali. So at that time, it was a no for Tamils to marry, for intermarriage between Tamils and other Indian Malayalis and other communities in Singapore, not even religions. But she stood her ground and she said no, because they were neighbors and they grew up together. And she said no, she wants to marry him. So she did. And of course then all her troubles started, didn't it? Because we had the fight for independence, we had struggled, trade unionists, struggle in trade union movements. The trade union movement was dominated by Indians. A lot of them got into trouble. Devanaya was a teacher, but he lost his job because of involvement in politics. So when he came out of prison, he was giving private tuition. And then he was in and out of prison. So who do you think supported the family? Mrs. Devanaya, who didn't go beyond primary school education. And then, of course, she became the First Lady of Singapore. It's an amazing story. And that kind of stories, we have many kinds of similar stories in Singapore that's not heard about or written about. That we have to tell those stories, you know. And of course, she suffered arrows and whatever. I've forgotten the Shakespearean quotation of outrageous fortune because of who she was married to, because of the politics at the time. The next person I want to point out is India. And at the age of 17, she was going around giving public speeches. And she came to Singapore. I mentioned earlier how the male population outnumbered the female population. There were very few women in Singapore. And the ratio improved, and that is true of the Chinese population as well as Indian population. Indian population was even more, the women were more outnumbered by the men. But the Chinese population began to improve, but then they had the concubine system. A man can have any number of women. They don't have to, they only had customary marriages. So there were lots of abandoned women and abandoned children. So Sharif Foster arrived from Singapore, arrived from India as a political activist. And there was no, women were not involved in politics at that time, had no idea They weren't engaged in any kind of, they were just basically wives and housewives, you know. But she mobilized the women of Singapore and set up the Singapore Council of Women, which is not the same as the Singapore Council of Women's Organization that is around now. This was an earlier one, which was set up specifically to address this issue of polygamy. And at the same time, Mrs. Devanaya was in Parliament. Mrs. Devanaya, because Devanaya had to go to KL to set up a new political organization because he was Malaysian, Mrs. Devanaya stayed behind, and Lee Kuan Yew asked Mrs. Devanaya to stand for his constituency at Mulmin. And she did, and she had got the highest votes in that election year. And she was in Parliament. Remember, she only had a primary school education, but she was the one who worked and supported and raised her children. When Devanaya was in and out of prison and hardly earning any money, you know. And so when Devanaya went to KL, Mrs. Devanaya took over. Lee Kuan Yew asked her to stand for election, and she won the election. And she talked, and she went to Parliament, and she spoke in Tamil. And she supported the women's rights, supported the women's charter movement, which was being organized by Mrs. Shireen Foster. Mrs. Shireen Foster, Mrs. Devanaya, that was the time, 5 years period, when Singapore women were fighting for the right of women in marriage, because most of them were not married, they were concubines, and they were then abandoned with large families, you know. So she spoke up, Mrs. Devanaya spoke up in support of the Women's Charter and the women's rights. You also have, that's Mrs. Shireen Foster, yeah. Mrs. Devanaya. Then you have Mrs. Checha Davis, who was married to Tamil, she herself was Malayali. And she set up the first women's hostel. She was the first Asian woman to become president of Young Women's YWCA. Yeah, YWCA. She was the first Asian to become one. And she set up the first women's hospital, and she didn't have enough money to do that. She sold her own property to do that, to fund that. So that's Mrs. Checha Davis. Gone. Sorry. These three women were early professionals working with, she was working in the ministry, the first woman, I believe, to get honors in, BA honors in Singapore with the new arts faculty. And she was the one first to set up, you remember I talked about the abandoned women before Women's Charter came into being, when marriage was not legalized. Women lived in families, and you have lots of abandoned children. So Daisy Whitellingham was social worker, who set up the first fostering scheme for abandoned children. Yelakambaya, set up in 1970 with Mrs. Bhatia, I think, who was the wife of the commissioner, Indian commissioner, set up AWA, the Association of Women for Welfare, AWWA, Women's Welfare Organization, Association, 1970. And currently they serve almost 20,000 clients a year. They have 17 centers. Centers serving the needs of the aged, needs of the disabled, needs of the chronic sick, 17 centers in Singapore. Germany was the queen of the long distance, and she was SG's Sportsman of the Year for 1977 and 1981. Where are the other Tamil girls? What's happened to them? Somewhere. But thank you so much. You have done us all proud, you know. I remember reading about her through those years. Thank you. Then you had Nirmala. Nirmala was a very well-known journalist who later set up a home for children, a foster home for children. Thank you. Yeah. So I'm highlighting first all the Tamil women. Then you have Kanwaljit Soin, who moved the bill in Parliament for the laws against domestic violence. So majority of these women who have contributed to Singapore's well-being are Tamil women. And we don't hear about them, you know, because what we have is the system which has divided us into Indians, Tamils, Malays, and Chinese. So what happens is when a Tamil woman or Indian woman achieves, she's featured in Channel 8. So the rest of the community don't hear about that. If she is dealing with something Chinese, then she is in Channel 8. So who get into Channel 5? I have no idea. Oh, I didn't. I got into Vasanta, thanks to Kalpani. But that's our problem. How do we? So my final question is, how do you? There's so much talent, so many educated people. How do you then preserve your culture at the same time as the ability to work across cultures? You know, without people like me are anglicized Malayalis who have lost our language. I can't speak, nobody around me to speak Malayalam. We've been enabled to cross the cultures. But how do you, as a Tamil community with the richest culture in the world, with the oldest language in the world, how do you then preserve your culture at the same time be part of our mainstream community? And that is important. Otherwise, you're a dying race. What is it that you want? And I think you have to, as a community, get together and talk about it. I don't know whether you do. How many women, for instance, sit in all these community committees, the Hindu Endowment Board, for instance? Any women there? Any women? You have? No. In the Indian Heritage Board, any women? There are women. There are 3 women. Good. So you have to then get into these. You have to function not just within your community, but across communities. Okay, how do you do that? And that's a discussion for your community. Secondly, since this is the end of a discussion on feminism, your mothers of Indian boys, how are you educating them? You know as well as anybody and everybody across, in fact, the whole of Singapore thinks Indian men beat up their wives. And domestic violence is a problem. But I don't know whether it's more of a problem among Indian community and other communities because we don't have the statistics. But it is a serious problem. So the mothers have to ask themselves, how do you raise your sons? So my 2 questions were that, how do you raise your sons? How do you function, preserve your own culture, and also be able to function? Because if you don't, Indian girls are suffering. Indian girls are the last to get jobs. Always the last to get jobs. They are discriminated against. So you really have to be able to move across cultures. That's all I was coming here to celebrate Tamil contribution and Tamil women's contribution, so I don't want to end with that note. But I do want to say you have a lot to contribute. You have enriched, from the examples that I have given, you have enriched the life of the Singapore community, and I mean across the various divisions. And you can continue to do that. I haven't seen young women coming up. Are they? And Ashwini, where are you? You have responsibility, not just for yourself, but for the community as well. Thank you very much for listening to my
Connie, since you provoked me, I want to share something with you, but at the same time, because it's of value to everyone else, I decided to come up. On the 7th of December, part of your prayers will be answered by the Indian Heritage Society, Indian Heritage Center and the Institute of Policy Studies where I work, because on that day, there will be a launch of a 2-volume book. One is called, both of them are called Sojourners to Settlers. Volume 1 is Tamils in Southeast Asia. The second volume...
Tamil women as well?
Tamils inclusive of men and in between.
Okay.
The second one is Tamils in Singapore. I have the privilege of being the editor of this. The initiative came from the Indian Heritage Center. And while that will make you happy, you will still remain unhappy because the women's history is incomplete. But that's not just for Tamil women. Women's history in Singapore is incomplete, okay? So that's the first thing. And much of what you said, you will learn a lot more from that one book. The second thing I also want you to know, and I want the rest of the audience to know, there is a new organization called the Center for Singapore Tamil Culture. And that main mission is to take Tamil culture to the others, which is what you're concerned, and equally others' cultures to Tamil. I just happen to be the director of that